Hello, everyone. Welcome to the reading overview video for Module 4. This week, we'll be reading one chapter. This is Chapter 9, Individuals and Identity, Agency and History. This is pages 200 to 219. So this week, we'll be reading about individual decision-making. We'll be looking at identity and power. And what I mean by power is social power, looking particularly at social structure, the power dynamics within those systematics, and how individuals are to behave and able to express their agency, navigate with their positionality in society. This is using a framework that we call agency and structuration theory. This frames our decisions beyond our biological needs and the connection to our environment, that is the natural environment, and it looks to recognize an individual's positionality within a social setting, a social structure. This is used to interpret how individual behavioral choices are influenced and what sorts of cultural practices are at play for groups of people, and explain why people did what they did in the past. You'll see how archaeologists frame individual choices in relation to social structures and how archaeologists interpret the interplay of various power dynamics between individuals and between individuals and groups. And you'll see how this can vary greatly depending on the individual and the society. The first example that we'll get to see this through is the story of La Melaninche. And this is an individual otherwise known as Doña Marina, an indigenous woman of Mexico who was influential and pivotal to Hernan Cortez and his conquest of the Aztec Empire for the Spanish Empire. And we'll see how trading one empire for another affects an individual like La Melaninche. We'll see how her particular circumstances led her to liberation from one oppressive system, but ultimately led in another way to another oppressive system by doing what it was that she had to do in order to obtain her original freedom. This is a sort of catch-22 situation of individual agency, but it shows you the salience of social power dynamics, the continuation of power dynamics in the transformation from one social system to another. And again, it reinforces how truly powerful societal power dynamics are and the ideologies that guide them in our lives. Just when we think we escape one, we are then affected by another. We'll read about an individual after this that had quite a different positionality and a different social system, social setting that they were a part of. We'll also watch a film about this individual that shows the excavation and the study of their remains, their bioarchaeological remains. This individual is none other than King Richard III from the end of the medieval period in Europe. Here we'll consider the decisions that Richard made within the structural limits and allowances for his choices, which some would say are fit for a king, yet also, some will say that this was an individual who was given an unfortunate lot in life. And we will see how this can be and how this was interpreted by archaeologists, specifically bioarchaeologists who have investigated Richard's osteological remains. Building on bioarchaeological methods, we will see some of the various ways that archaeologists have used biological remains to tell us about the life of individuals in the past and the society that they came from, as well as their position in that society. There's a lot of insights about the social behaviors of an individual that are left on their skeleton, including how they lived their life, whether they were in good or bad health, whether that health was particularly well nourished from a healthy diet, or perhaps had suffered from specific nutrient deficiencies. Perhaps they had suffered from illnesses or injuries throughout their lifetime that they had sustained. And maybe even what they look like or what had even caused their death. A lot can be discerned from the methods of bioarchaeological studies, and it relies on the anatomical structure of individuals and the marks that are left on their osteological remains. This is important for knowing how we know what we know about individuals and their place in society and the effects that their society had on them and their position in it. So as you learn about these perspectives, consider what all this has to say about your own place in our current social structure. Think about, what is our social structure? What is your position in it? And how might this be understood by archaeologists of the future? This chapter concludes with a segment on social violence and how archaeologists recognize that in the record. This is a really important aspect and relevant part of archaeology that's done today, relevant for our populations that are alive today. This is really about the impact. When we talk about social violence in the past, we're talking about the impact that is left on one's body from enduring the systematic inability and prohibition of people to exercise their agency over their own lives, which is to say, how they make their own decisions in their own lives are affected through the means of social violence. So we will see how this is informing us of people's positionality in terms of their race, their class, and their gender. Specifically, we're going to be looking this week at examples of racism and how enslaved conditions had left marks on those individuals in the past. This again is going to emphasize the relevance of archaeology to our current society, to help us understand the diversity of human experiences, to see what lasting effects look like for different individuals and different groups of humans over so many different configurations of social structures, and to understand better where people today are coming from with different needs. Archaeologists who study social violence in the past also look to understand how social justice appeared or not in the past, and how that relates to today is critical, because by looking at how violence that existed in the past is related to particular social systematics and decision making, we can begin to look more at how violence exists today and how that too might be caused by social systems, and how choices that are now transformed from those that used to exist and include different power dynamics than existed in the past are continuing to leave their mark. For instance, we will be looking this week at how the power dynamics of the slave to master relationship existed in Euro-American colonialism. We will see the particular marks of violence that are indicative of this power dynamic, and how this is a remnant of a particular social ideology called racism, and a social system known as chattel slavery. The stories behind where these bodies are discovered, the condition of those remains, the context that they're found in, and the inequalities of violence are all revealed through the archaeological context that are covered in this week's reading and the other film that we'll be watching called Digging for Slaves, that you'll be watching for your discussion assignment. We will consider the violence of racism in that time in place of settler colonialism in the past. And we will also want to be sure to consider how that persists today, what the legacy of those impacts are today. And although it has changed and perhaps shows itself on the remains of humans in contemporary times in slightly different ways, we want to think about how it might still be perceived by the archaeological record in the future and why that is. We want to consider the differences in positionality and social structure between the remains, also not just the remains of between slaves and masters, but the remains of people that we're considering in our readings this week. So the remains of slaves and those of King Richard III. What similarities might we draw between those of individuals that were enslaved and that of King Richard, and what differences might be understood as related through the different social systematics and the choices that each individual could make in either case. Think about how those comparisons might look today in a transformed sense between those people who are at the receiving end of today's structural violence and societal violences, how that violence has changed over time, and how there are those who are privileged or protected from that violence for the most part, just as might have been the case for King Richard. Again, this is all to help us think about current day conversations on racism and the legacies of settler colonialism that are ongoing today, and help us think about what changes still need to occur, what injustices still need to be addressed that are linked to our societal structures. Another video that might be worth watching after this reading that just recently came out on Netflix is called Descendants. For those of you that had an interest sparked by archaeological studies on the remain of the colonial slave period in America, especially for those interested in how archaeologists help steward those remains and provide a meaningful contribution to those who have the community and most personal connection with those archaeological remains. This is a wonderful video looking at the Descendants in Africa Town, which is a location just north of Mobile, Alabama, and you'll get to look at some of the archaeological contexts that are considered from the slave ship that had brought over their descendants, or rather the ancestors of these descendants that are featured in the video. So there's a lot of work ongoing that considers critical and difficult parts of America's past right now, in particular archaeological work. Something that comes to mind that has been an ongoing part of these contexts are the efforts that are being directed by the Department of Interior. The Department of Interior is our federal organization headed by Deborah Holland of La Guana Pueblo, who is an indigenous woman herself, right? And has been directing the bioarchaeological investigation of children's grave sites at American Indian boarding schools that were set up across the country and were in commission under the U.S. government during the 17th to mid-20th century in the nation. So looking at some of the disturbing yet illuminating uncoverings that have been the results of these investigations is something that I expect to see lots of media coverage, and perhaps even some of the videos that we have watched will also grow to include some of those critical investigations. Okay, that's all I have for you this week on your week's readings and some of the information that it will put you in touch with. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks.